Welcome everybody to the KNOCA workshop, revisiting the impact of the French Convention for the Climate 5 years on. Just to let you know, this is actually a re-recording of the introduction. For some reason, we had a few technical problems, so we just decided to do another version of it. The rest of the call is as it was live. I'm still wearing the same shirt, so at least there's some continuity. I'm sitting in the same chair, so you wouldn't have known unless I told you. Anyway, it's really important. I think this is a really important workshop. It's 5 years since the convention began its work, and I think without doubt the Convention has been one of the most, if not the most influential climate assembly we've seen. And I think other assemblies that have followed have either followed in a sort of positive sense of trying to reinforce what the Convention did, or have developed their design and their impact strategy based on an analysis of what they didn't think the assembly did well. So there's a sense in which it's really critical to our understanding of current assembly practice. It's very clear that the French Convention is an outlier. It is different from other assemblies. It was commissioned by the president, who made a very strong commitment to no filter, and that has become a massive issue of contention about what Macron meant by that. It's the best funded climate assembly we've seen. It's the assembly which has had the most time in order to deal with the complex issues that were facing it. It had a much more porous interface between assembly members and civil society organizations, activists, and the media. And today's subject, it seems to have had substantial impact, although that level of impact is a matter of contention. For example, you can find some people who will say the assembly had almost minimal impact on on legislation. Others will point to quite significant change, and many people in between. I'm actually in Paris at the moment, and you talk to two people and you'll get 2-3 different versions of actually what happened. So what we've done at KNOCA in collaboration with the European Climate Foundation is to commission 3 pieces of work to try and give us a baseline about what's actually happened. And we're going to hear presentations from all 3 of those today. And drafts of their reports are already available. We will be finalizing those in the next few weeks. The first report is by Mellier and Selma Tilikete, and they were looking at existing research that's been done by academics and by policy organizations, so both academic literature and grey literature, and trying to understand the kind of impact that literature suggests the convention has had using the knowledge network on climate assembly impact evaluation framework. So that's the first piece that we'll be hearing about. The second is a focus particularly on the policy impact of the recommendations, which is a study that's been led by Alina Averchenkova. And that focuses very much on what has the uptake been, and has there been, if you like, cherry picking, particular things have been taken up by government and others not. And the third piece takes us away from policy impact and focuses more on media impact, particularly looking at digital media coverage. And this is a report that's been authored by José Luis Fernández-Martínez, and will be and colleagues will be presented by him, and also Coco Bates, who worked with him as part of that team. So what follows, and I can say this now because we've actually had the workshop, is quite a dense presentation. What I mean is a lot of information, and in some ways I apologize for that. It's a lot to get your head around, a lot of graphs, a lot of data, but actually also I don't apologize, because we really need to be having debates about what has actually happened, and that these should be debates based on fact, based on evidence. So be aware that the presentations are very short. They're sort of 10-minute presentations of much longer reports. See them as a taster, if you like, for you to be able to go back and see some more. And I think it's really important for us to have this baseline to be able to make some judgments about the success or otherwise of the French Convention and how it compares to other conventions. And it's going to be really important in the future for us to think, given what we know about the impact of the French Convention, how do we design other assemblies in order, given what we know about is successful or unsuccessful in relation to impact? So I will leave my introduction there. We'll go back to the original call, and this is the presentation that was given by Claire and Selma based on existing research, and that's being collated, their collation of that existing research. So enjoy the rest of the workshop.
So thank you for the invitation to present and contribute to this field of research. So I'm Claire Mellier, I'm from ISWE Foundation, and I was one of the observer researchers of the Convention Citoyenne. There were about 30 of us, and Selma will introduce herself in a minute. So what we did with our research was looking at all the research that has been published so far and analyzing it through the lens of the Impact Evaluation Network, Impact Evaluation Framework developed by CAS, the Center for Climate Change and Social Transformation at Bath University. So the reason for using that framework was motivated by the fact that people put different meaning on impact, and what the framework is doing really in a very useful way is exploring what are the different aspects of impact. So in terms of our research methodology, we did a desk-based review of the research published in English and French languages between January 2020 and July 2024. And by research, we include what we mean by black and grey research. So the academic literature, but also other research that hasn't been peer reviewed. And what we did was mapping that research against the different categories of impact in the latest version of the CAS framework. So some of you might have seen a draft that was shared on the KNOCA website, which dates back from June 2022, but we've used the latest version that will be published soon, I understand, from February 2024. So this is briefly the impact evaluation framework, and it's looking at 3 types of impact: instrumental impacts, conceptual impacts, and capacity impacts, which are which are new ways of acting on climate change, new ways of understanding climate change and climate action, and new capacity and resources for acting on climate change. And then we've got on the left-hand side, you can see 3 areas of impact. First one is state actors. So national, regional government decision-making, and for instance, that include policymakers, politicians, parliamentarians, civil servants, non-state actors and civil society, so the wider society, including the members of the public, media, businesses, etc. And the final one, which is more sometimes more difficult to grasp, but it's looking at systems and structures. So it's helping to look at sometimes what people define as, the systemic underlying features of decision making and practices. So very briefly, this is the impact framework. And our research has identified 96 productions of various types and sizes. And you can see here the breakdown of the research. So 35 articles in scientific journals, for instance, and 9 of which formed a special feature in a journal that Graham was one of the contributors to, and Selma, and 18 blogs, 7 chapters in scientific books, 2 PhD theses, and many more. In terms of what this research covered, we identified that around a third of the research, so about 33 items, have at least one subsection dedicated to analyzing the impact of the Convention, but only a dozen of them are mostly focused on impact analysis. So what this is showing is that it's opened up a space for debate. As Graham said in his introduction, many people have very different views on the impact the Convention has had. What this research has shown to us is that people have managed to look at impacts so far until Alina's research until it's been published. It has been mostly the French government through a website that was assessing the translation of the recommendation into legislation that was providing the most kind of up-to-date analysis of impact. But as we know, this in a way is the assessment of impact through the eyes of a key stakeholder, which is the French government, rather than impact assessment through the analysis of external evaluation and academic review. And in terms of the publication that we reviewed, dealing with the impact, what they've covered mostly are impacts on climate policies and legislation, impact on Assembly members, on decision-making processes within the ministries, on the reception of the Convention Citoyenne process in the wider public, on social and environmental movements, and on the impact on the media treatment of climate policy and deliberation. And Selma in a moment will show the gaps.
Yes, thank you, Claire. So I'll try to summarize in a few minutes what we find when we analyze the research on the French Convention with the impact evaluation framework proposed by KNOCA. So I'm going to report on the number and type of studies carried out on the various aspects of impact, but I'm also going to give some insights on the results of the studies. And as a reminder, in the table, the publications in green are scientific publications. So firstly, there is a significant number of publications on impacts on state actors. So when it comes to new ways of acting on climate, there are many productions that offer an assessment of the proposals implemented by the government. It means that they give a quantitative percentage. In a moment, Alina will be presenting the research on policy impact, but until now, there have been no academic analysis of this policy impact of the convention, as all the assessments were produced by stakeholders, including the government. When it comes to the way state actors understand climate, the most developed study is focused on how this deliberative process has been received in Parliament. It shows that the resistance is still at play among a part of the elected representatives and calls into question the idea of a fluid integration of climate assemblies alongside the traditional spaces of representative democracy. And to conclude on state actors, studies on their capacity impacts have shown that the French CCC led to a reform of a big institution called the Conseil économique, social et environnemental into a chamber of citizen participation, but with a rather vague mandate. And another study shows that the CCC has not led to greater democratization under Macron, and that it may even have reinforced mistrust of this type of process. Turning now to impacts on non-state actors and civil society. So one on new ways of acting on climate change, civil society actors have been analyzed mainly through the important transformations of ecological and political practices of the Assembly members themselves. Only one study looks at environmental movements and shows that they have taken different positions depending on their level of institutionalization and their lifespan. And finally, another study focuses on the corporate sector, and it shows that they changed in behavior from initially neglecting the CCC and its work to an all-out and ultimately successful lobbying offensive to have the Convention's recommendation either removed or watered down in the drafting of the final climate and resilience bill. The change of understanding climate change within the larger public has been analyzed through the media in a master thesis made by Olivier. It shows that the media coverage was extensive but focused on major events like the arrival of the president, and no media contributed to a public debate on the content of the CCC's proposals. Surveys have also shown that the majority of the population was aware of the process and in favor of the Assembly's proposals. And to our knowledge, there have been no studies on the impact of the capacities and resources of non-state actors yet. And to finish with the impacts on systems and structure, there are far fewer productions, and most of the analyses that focus on the impact of the CCC on decision-making processes, and their results are ambivalent. On the one hand, they suggest that the making of the climate law has set a precedent in the legislative process in France by involving CCC Assembly members in the writing of the bill. But on the other hand, this capacity was ill-defined, and the process of drafting this law has also had negative impacts. And apart from the studies, there are no other studies on impacts on underlying features of practices, like no analysis on how the CCC may or may not have transformed the way climate change is understood or the role of deliberation in addressing it. And to conclude, there are obvious gaps in research on the systemic aspects, especially with regards to the conceptual and capacity impacts. And we wanted to mention one research project that was initiated and that tried to respond to this lack, and it is named I for I, and we can put the link in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire and Selma. That was really great. And trying to summarize 33 different studies in 10 minutes is a really difficult task. So thank you for that. At this point, I'd like to pass on to Alina, who's going to talk to us about a recent study that was mentioned by Claire and Selma on the actual policy impact of the French Convention. I'm often in rooms where I hear people say there was no impact, and then I'll be in other rooms where they say there's 80% impact. So I'm very interested to get a sense from Alina as to what she thinks the actual impact of the Assembly is. Alina, over to you.
Thank you, Graham. Hello, everyone. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors on this piece, which is Arnaud Koehl, who is here with us today, and Graham Smith. So I'm presenting on behalf of the three of us. So in 10 minutes, I'll try to give you the flavor of what we've done. I think, as we've already mentioned, there has been quite a different reporting on the impact of the convention, and there seems to be disagreement. So if we look at the government's figures and the headline, over 80% recommendations have been followed through in some ways. But what we wanted to understand, actually to unpack those figures. So the first thing we've done is to break them down into recommendations that were followed in the original form or were indeed reinforced through the follow-up, versus recommendations which have been only partially implemented or weakened, and then also looked at recommendations which have been either abandoned, have not been translated to any policy measure, or where the government has claimed that existing measure already addressed them. The second objective for our analysis was to understand to what extent the follow-up for policy to the recommendations reflects what we see in the academic literature on public participation processes as cherry picking by public authorities. There is a claim in the previous literature that public authorities tend to pick and favor recommendations that contain ideas that have already been part of the political debate. And so to understand that, we have analyzed 4 reports which went as input into the Assembly, including one by the convener, Economic, Social, and Environmental Council, another report by the High Council on Climate, and then 2 reports by the NGOs, Hewlett Foundation and also Réseau Action Climat, which was indeed a synthesis of ideas presented by other NGOs. And we analyzed each recommendation to understand whether the idea, or the precise recommendation, or just the topic were introduced in those key reports to have a proxy for whether they were already part of the discussion going into the Assembly. And finally, we have looked at different factors which may explain how the government responded to the recommendations. I'll start with highlights of our results. So what we find, having analyzed this data, is that the convention had actually greater follow-up than it is usually given credit for. And I'll show you some graphics in the next slides. We do notice differences in cherry picking on follow-up by the government based on policy sectors on which recommendations focus, based on policy instruments. In particular, there seems to be favor towards incentives in the follow-up of the government, and also to the level of specificity of recommendation. We also notice that legal route through which recommendation is implemented also has a bearing on the level of follow-up. And finally, there is a difference whether recommendation targets actions by individuals, public sector, or businesses. In general, in terms of the novelty of ideas presented by the convention, we actually find quite a high percentage of ideas originating from the convention itself. Again, we have to be careful about claiming causality here. The fact that we didn't find an idea in the 4 reports by the institutions and NGOs doesn't mean the idea didn't exist before, but we are using it as a proxy to highlight that the idea emerged from the deliberations, both from expert inputs and discussions among the participants. And the ideas that were produced as part of the convention, not mentioned in the reports, had higher chances of being rejected, but there is also a great share of those ideas that have been adopted in full or had partial follow-up. So just let me show you some of the headline figures, and you can see the detail in the briefing itself. So about 20% of all recommendations have been followed up in the original form or have been reinforced. And further 51% have been followed up in a partial form or through a measure that was either weaker than in the original proposal or using a different policy instrument, for example, instead of regulation, using an incentive-based measure. And then about 22% have been abandoned, not implemented to date or vetoed. And I have to say this is based on the data reported for September 2023 by the government. Now, if we look at where recommendations originated from, what is interesting is that we can clearly see that convention has played an agenda-setting role. There were only about 46% of the recommendations which were found either in the convention reports or in the convention convener reports or the other reports we have considered by the NGOs and major institutions. So there is quite a higher share of ideas which has been articulated as part of the deliberations themselves. Now, if we look at the legal route for the follow-up, so the graph on the left represents the different legal vehicles through which recommendations have been implemented. And this is based both on the information provided by the government, but also analysis by Le Monde and Reporter, which we have used to tag the implementation of the recommendations. And we can see that by far the predominant vehicle for follow-up, which has picked up the largest share of recommendation, is the Framework Climate Change Law, Climate and Resilience Law, followed by executive policy, anti-Greece, and also some subsidiary legislation. However, if we look at, did the legal route have any bearing on the level of follow-up and the rejection of recommendations? What is interesting here is that on the right-hand side, you could see that recommendations that were followed through the Framework Climate Change Law and through other laws had less rejection, or there is a greater also share of recommendation which were adopted in the original form or have indeed been reinforced. And the follow-up route, which had the largest share of recommendations which were modified, is actually executive action by government. So the specific policies, which I think is very interesting. So we can clearly see greater cherry picking through governmental policies than through legislation. Now, does level of detail matter? Because what we could see is some recommendations were quite detailed. They didn't just outline the problem that needs to be addressed, but they also were quite specific in suggesting a particular measure or a set of measures that should be put in place. Other recommendations were a bit more general. And so we've tagged them based on the level of detail. And what we can see is that more detailed recommendation had a slightly greater rate of follow-up. And the recommendations with limited detail were on average 1.6 times more likely to be abandoned, assigned to an existing measure, or not translated into follow-up at all. Now, we also ran the analysis to see to what extent the fact that the measure was introduced in one of the policy reports, in the 4 policy reports that went into the convention, whether it had a bearing on the follow-up. And what we note from this analysis, and this is a table on the right-hand side, is that proposals that did not appear in the advisory reports had a greater chance of being abandoned by government. And this is what is to be expected. As we said, the previous literature also suggests that governments tend to favor ideas that were part of the political debate. However, you could also see that there is quite a large share of original ideas arising from the convention that have been adopted in the original form or reinforced. So 53% of the recommendations that were implemented in the original form have not been found in the reports. That's a really high potential level of agenda setting impact for the Assembly. Now, what we also find is that cherry picking is impacted by the type of policy instrument proposed in the recommendation. So in general, on the left-hand side, you could see that the government has favored incentives versus regulation compared to the ideas proposed by the convention versus ideas that were implemented in the follow-up. And incentives in general had a higher rate of being adopted in full or reinforced, and lower rate of being abandoned or not translated into follow-up compared to regulatory-based measures such as standards, bans, and measures related to command and control interventions. And finally, we also noticed that the target actor in the recommendation has played an important some role in the fate of the recommendation, it seems, through our data. So overall, measures targeting public sector on average were more likely to be abandoned or not translated into follow-up, and also less likely to be modified or implemented partially. So that's quite an interesting, I think, insight. Yet if we look at the private sector, those measures were most likely to be modified, which potentially points to the impact of lobby by private sector in the context of adoption of specific measures. So I will stop here and I suppose my overall message is, I think what we're finding is that the impact of the convention really is quite significant. It depends, of course, how one reads the numbers, but I think with over 70% of measures having had follow-up in the original or reinforced form or partially modified, that's a quite high level of follow-up. And I think also the agenda setting, not just legitimizing, but agenda setting role of the convention can be clearly seen from our analysis. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to discussing more in the next section.
Alina, that's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a really interesting question. We've talked about this, about what is the threshold at which point we decide that something is successful or not. And I guess part of this is also structured by the fact that President Macron used this no filter question. So maybe that's actually, maybe that queers the debate. I'm not entirely sure, but maybe we can come back to that in a minute. So thanks so much, Alina. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce José Luis and Coco Bates. And José Luis and Coco, as I explained earlier, are looking at a different type of impact. It was referred briefly by Claire and Selma, but their question is actually about the impact on digital media of assemblies. And when they were, they originally did a study in Spain, and we thought it was such an interesting study that we'd asked them to do it across 4 or 5 national climate assemblies, which thankfully they decided they would do. And so this is the first attempt to try and do some comparative analysis of the impact and social engagement with digital media of climate assemblies. There's a bigger report, and it is a much bigger report, behind this. But I've asked José Luis and Coco to specifically focus on the French Convention and what we can learn from that. Obviously, there'll be some comparative stuff in there. So, José Luis, my friend, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Graham. Hello, everyone. Well, first, I'd like to thank KNOCA for inviting us to participate in this forum and for giving us the opportunity to discuss our study on the impact of citizens' assemblies on digital media. Well, over the past few months, we have been comparing citizen assemblies in France, Austria, Scotland, Spain, and the UK. However, in this presentation, we will focus specifically on the French Convention. I will begin by outlining the objectives, methodology and conclusion of our study, and later my colleague Coco will present the main findings. So to assess the impact of the French Convention on digital media, we focus on 3 key dimensions. Level of media covered, the main characteristic of the content published about it, and also the social media engagement with that content. While we aim to approach this from a comparative perspective, it's important to note, for example, that the assemblies didn't take place at the same time, nor did they follow identical designs. So this factor needed to be considered in our analysis. Please, Coco. So let me highlight some key points about the methodology we use to assess the media impact. The first step was to conduct an automated search using specialized software that identifies all digital content containing links to the official websites of the assemblies. The second step involved cleaning this database, and afterward, we selected the top ranking entries, like 215 per country. And recorded specific information such as the publication date, the name and type of media outlet, and if the main topic addressed in the article was the assembly or not, among other aspects. Finally, using all this data, we perform various comparative analysis. So here we are focusing only on the quantitative analysis. Well, after conducting the automated search, we observed that the amount of digital content containing links to the French Convention website was significantly higher compared to the other assemblies. Moreover, even after the data cleaning process, the French Convention continued to show a much broader media coverage, as we can see in this figure, in this graph. And now my colleague Coco will present some specific findings, and I will back with a conclusion. Over to you, Coco.
Thanks, José Luis. Once we had this database of entries that José Luis mentioned, we were able to analyze the evolution of the digital media coverage over time, which is illustrated in this graph here. Bear in mind, this is just the top 242 entries about the convention in the database. And so there are three major peaks that we can see here. The first one took place in June 2020, which coincided with the publication of the convention's final report immediately after the end of the assembly. And this is actually the case in all the national assemblies analyzed in our report, that the most significant peak in coverage aligns with the publication of the final reports. The second highest peak was in March 2021, indicated by the green dot there. And this coincided with the start of parliamentary debate on France's climate change law. And finally, there's a third and much smaller peak that took place in September 2020, and there was actually no specific reason found for this increase in coverage. On this next slide here, we can see the most common media outlet types publishing content about 5 different assemblies. In the case of the French Convention, digital newspapers were by far the most common media outlet type among the top 256 entries, with a 41% share of the coverage. And you can see that digital newspapers were also very common in all the other assemblies that we were looking at. What is really notable here is that almost 1 in 4 entries about the convention came from audiovisual media, mainly TV, radio, and podcasts. And this, as you can see, is the second highest or second most common media outlet type for this assembly. And you can see that it's significantly higher than the levels for TV and radio of any other assembly. And this high percentage, is almost 23%, suggests a greater awareness of the assembly among the general public, as content was not just limited to printed media. It also it was just able to reach broader areas of society. Turning now to the social media engagement with this content published about the assembly. And when I say engagement, I mean the number of shares on X, formerly known as Twitter, and the number of shares, likes, and comments on Facebook. And in this graph on the left here, we can see that the convention received, on average, significantly more engagement than any other assembly analyzed. With 233 average engagements per entry, the convention has more than double the average engagement of content about Climate Assembly UK, which was the assembly with the second highest engagement levels. And finally, on the right here, we can see the distribution of engagement across the 2 social media platforms. And what's worth highlighting here is that in the case of the French Convention, content was significantly or shared significantly more, almost 3 times more on Facebook than on X. And this is really interesting because X sort of tends to be more commonly used by people in politics, in the media, whereas Facebook is used by a much broader section of society. And so this really indicates broad penetration into diverse layers of society.
Thank you, Coco. Well, to conclude, just a few ideas. So first, we have seen that the French Convention has had a great impact on digital media and has generated more public debate on social media compared to the other assemblies we analyze. On the other hand, we have observed both common and distinct patterns among the assemblies. For instance, many peaks in coverage coincide with significant and common moments in the assemblies, such as the launch or the publication of proposals. However, other peaks are linked to strategic communication decisions or contextual factors. Therefore, it seems to indicate that there is a potential to plan specific strategies that could increase media impact in future assemblies, for example. Thank you for your attention.
Oh, thank you so much, Jose Luis and Coco. Can you bring in the other presenters as well? I'm going to try and navigate a brief conversation, and I'm going to be. Got Selma as well. I'm going to be very unfair on Claire and Selma, I think. Well, I know it's unfair. I'm going to give you the first opportunity to respond. You two have kind of got a good overview of the kind of research that's been done up to date, and then you've now just seen or read and also had a quick flick through what Alina has done and what Jose Luis and Coco has done. How does that fit with what you've seen before, or do you think actually the research, they're adding something new in here? So Claire, I don't know whether you would like to start, or Selma. How do you respond given what what you know about the assembly up to date to this new data that you're seeing?
So thank you. That's really detailed, and although I've had a quick look at the reports, I feel like I've got a lot to digest. But my initial response is with regards to Alina and the team's research. What I'm struck by is maybe the differentiation between full implementation or a partial implementation and the watering down, because what's been interesting, I think, with the assessment of impact is that there has been controversies around the fact that some recommendations were presented as coming from the assembly and then being groundbreaking. I'm thinking particularly around the travel alternatives to flights for internal flights. And initially, the proposal was that it would be for journeys of 4 hours. And we see then that in the climate and resilience bill, that's 2.5 hours, for instance. So what I think I'm interested in exploring a bit further is the aspect of the more systemic and how some of the most kind of transformative potentially policy recommendations were either watered down or not. So I wonder if that appears in the report, Alina, and how we can. I think there was a question in the chat that was about this.
Yeah, I'll pick that up. Joanne Font asked that as well. Selma, do you have any thoughts in response to the two in response to the two presentations in relation to your understanding of the wider research?
Yes. So how we said the research made by Alina and the others is the first one that is not made by a stakeholder, and the only one was the government who continued to update the numbers, and of course people were not had the first percentage of implementation and were so I mean this is a very important report about the policy impact. And for the one on from José Luis and Coco, the only other study that had been done was a master thesis in 2020, and so he couldn't continue to analyze this after 2020, and also it wasn't a comparison. So this report is very interesting in that sense, I think.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'm gonna before Alina, I want to ask you this because José, Joanne asked this as well, and I think it's a fair question, but also a very difficult question. Is we have this big category of modified, and this could potentially cover a whole realm of different types of modified. Just a little tweak to completely, you know, to almost gutting it, and but having some similar wording. And I know that, you know, and I should put my you know, Joanne Fontu asked the question, and Jose Luis is on this call, and myself, we did some work on cherry picking in Spain, and we used the same category, but we also recognize that category includes so many different things. So, I mean, first of all, fantastic that you've managed to do any analysis whatsoever. But now the question is, if you could do some more analysis, what would you want to do with that group of modified?
Well, thank you all for raising this. We did actually dig a little bit further into that category, and I think we present some examples and some headline figures in the briefing. So basically, we make a distinction. If you look within that modified category, in some cases, the measures differ in terms of the level of ambition. And in this category, it's only if the recommendation was more ambitious and what citizens have asked for compared to what was implemented, then it would be captured in this category. Otherwise, it would be reinforced, which is in the first 20%. The second type of difference is they might differ in the type of policy instrument that is being used. Say the citizens have asked for a ban, and the government has introduced an incentive. I can give you an example on ports. I think the let's see, there was an example where citizens have asked the government to introduce electricity supply infrastructure to make it available for ships and ports, so that that would encourage ships basically to shift to electricity. Instead, the government has decided to lower electricity tariffs while acting to the same objective. That is a different measure, and so that would be sitting in the alternative measure category, which is captured in the modified recommendations. In some cases, citizens have provided a figure on the funding that government needs to commit to addressing a particular problem. And the government might have followed through with funding, but the size of that funding might have been quite different, much lower. So that would also be captured in the modified category. So just to give you an idea of kind of the split, if we look within those modified, so 15% of
recommendations have had alternative measure aiming to reach the same objective introduced. And then so that's 15% would be an alternative measure rather than just running with what citizens have proposed, but maybe not implementing it fully. But what I would say is, I think you know, we've done this analysis based on our own judgment, kind of looking at the policies that we could find that are in place. I think for all of us, and also potentially for the credibility of those processes, I think
if I could recommend the policy choice is if the conveners actually and the government try to be more granular in the way they provide this information, rather than lumping it all together, actually indicating where an alternative measure has been put in place versus where something has been implemented in full. Of course, it does make numbers look less pretty, but I think it would make for more credible assessment of the impact of these processes.
I think it's still an interesting question. I mean, I think you raise it there, this issue about what we mean by modified, and maybe we need to be much more nuanced on this kind of, you know, original idea. Yeah. Anyway, we can talk some more about how we do this, but
so just to summarize, Graham, it's level of ambition, the choice of policy instrument, and then also I should have mentioned the accountability attached to it. There were a few of those. Yeah, so if there is no accountability, but citizens have asked for it, and then that's also modified and lowered.
That's really interesting. And I think, I mean, if this is something which Jose Luis has an interest in as well, I think there's an even more interesting issue here about whether or not the government explains why it's modified or why it has rejected. And I think on that, we actually have some problems. You know, we don't actually have a discourse here about we've done this because we just, you know, we're not seeing that kind of public explanation, but it's very, very interesting. Jose Luis and Coco, a couple of questions for you. First of all, I mean, the differences are really significant in terms of both the amount of media and where it's appearing and the amount it's being shared. Why do you think I mean, you know, this is a chance for you to speculate. This is not social science. This is speculation opportunity. Why do you think that is the case? And the second, I guess, comes from a question which comes from Stephen Bolcher, which is, do you think there's a relationship between the fact that there was this debate and the fact that we're talking about potentially talking about more implementation? Do you think I mean, you probably can't give an answer to that, but I think and then I guess the question that Laurie asks is, how do we know this isn't just noise? And, you know, kind of like, I mean, there's a really interesting question in there for you. So a whole bunch of questions in there about how come this is so different from other assemblies? And also, what can we read from it, do you think, really? So I don't know, Jose Luis, Coco, who wants to have a go at that first?
Okay, maybe I start if you want, Coco. Okay, I think the biggest difference is when we carry out the automatic search, okay? Then is when we see the biggest difference. But when after cleaning, no, the difference becomes smaller, and maybe it had to do with the resources to develop communication strategies. You know, I mean that it's a pending question to deeper why there is a difference between the first automatic search and after cleaning. Okay, in the paper we explain what has been the criteria to include or to exclude the entries, but there is a big difference between the first automatic search and the results after cleaning. So maybe it had to do with different communication strategies, but I'm not sure. We need to deeper into it. And about the possible association between more debate and more implementation, well, we need to investigate, no? But if I had to say something, of course, no, more debate put more pressure on government, no, and of course we could expect some impact in that direction, but we need to investigate, no. Coco,
yeah, just to follow up on that, I think we saw a ton, especially in the period after the recommendations were published. We initially saw there was a lot of debate in the media about the specific recommendations, and then later it sort of turned into this debate around the government implementation of the recommendations. And I think, like Jose Luis says, that puts a huge amount of spotlight on the recommendations and a bit more pressure perhaps on the government to take these on, but that is speculation mainly. And as for the comment about just is this just noise on social media. And there, we discussed in the report, you know, there are several limitations about how we've how this data that we collected, in terms of, you know, we can only see whether they're shared, liked, their shares, likes, or comments. We can't see what those comments are. We can't see, you know, whether the positive engagement, negative engagement. The only thing we can see is that there is this engagement. There's some kind of discussion around these topics, and whether that is, you know, we don't know how detailed that is or what that's about. But I do think that it speaks to a provocative nature of whatever that content is. Certain articles got significantly more engagement than others. You know, they went viral, and we don't know for what reasons, but they were generally about provocative issues, and that's what's quite interesting.
Thanks, Coco. That's really great. And I wonder, just very briefly, Claire or Selma, my sense is that one of the intriguing factors of the design of the French Convention was actually there was a more porous relationship with journalists, and journalists seem to be around the assembly more than they have been around other assemblies. And that was almost like I mean, partly that was a strategy of the organizers, but partly I think it was a response to the fact that Macron was so heavily associated with it. Do you have any sense from your experience of actually being in the assembly as observers as to whether or not you felt that you can see there was something different about the French Convention?
Well, because I was also a facilitator in Climat Assembly UK, I've experienced the different treatments of journalists in both processes. And what I was struck by with the Convention is actually the journalists were observing even the small breakout group deliberation and at times intervening in the deliberation, which, you know, was problematic in my opinion. But just that's my very subjective kind of reflection. I was surprised to not see a peak in your, you know, the moments you analyzed when there were two moments that I remembered personally thinking that would create more hype. Was the moment when Emmanuel Macron came to visit the Assembly members. And then the second time was when there was this leak around some of the draft recommendations during COVID, which was, I think, April 2020. So it's interesting to realize that there was no actually correlation in your study. And I don't understand the September peak either. So it's yeah, that would be interesting to unpack that.
Do you have any thoughts, Selma? Or
I just wanted to add that also the context where the convention was born was a very strong social movement, and half of the organizers were from climate activists or movements or social movements. So it was very different for French people at that time, because Macron had this promise of with no filter. And so since the beginning, the convention was clearly covered by media, and people were following it, even for saying that it was instrumental, etc. But so the context is not the same as the other that José Luis and Coco had analyzed.
Okay, that's really helpful. José Luis, Coco, one of you may just want to briefly, before we take a break, comment on this, the points that Claire made about there were these other points. My understanding is that you're highlighting the three most significant points. That doesn't mean that the points that she's talking about didn't have a peak. They just weren't as big. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And also, as that graph is limited just to the top, it's about 250 entries. So in that sense, you know, perhaps there was a much greater spike at the points that you mentioned there, but it wasn't reflected in the top 100, 250. And one other thing I wanted to add was that we actually saw, because of the approach of, like you were saying, Claire, having the journalists being so integral to the process, and there was so much transparency with the assembly members and what was going on during the assembly itself. We actually saw an increase in coverage during those months, which we didn't see in other assemblies. And so that was, there's this clear trajectory upwards towards the end of the assembly, which is significant and unique for the French Convention.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. Thanks for just a bit of sort of clarification and a bit of conversation. What I'd like to do, we'd like to take a 5-minute break, because that's actually just really good Zoom practice to do that. So we'll come back at 5 minutes past, but we're going to go into breakout groups at that point and reflect on what we've learned about how does what you've heard affect your views on the French Convention? Do you have any unanswered questions? What lessons should we learn from this studies for other future assemblies? And also, what else do you think we need to be looking at in terms of impact? So this isn't the end of the story. There was a question, a very particular question in there from Peter for you, Alina, about the study, but we didn't have time to get to that now. But I hope you'll join us again in about 3 or 4 minutes time. We'll send you out into groups with a couple of the presenters, and we'll come back and try and figure out where we are, what we understand the impact to be, and where we need to go now. Okay, so get away from your desk for at least 2 or 3 minutes. Thanks. That was a really interesting conversation. We had Coco in our group, and so that we were very focused on the media. But I've got Mark in here, so Mark clearly is going so excited to kind of like or trying to push me along. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what went on in your group and who was there? What was the conversation? What did we miss out on?
Oh, you missed out on a lot of stuff, Graham. Actually, I don't know why I was added to the spotlight now.
No, but I think because your colleagues just thought it would be really funny just to stick you on there, probably.
Clearly,
so.
that is.
Are you the person feeding back from your group?
Yes, I am. So,
okay. There is some connection.
We're not all. Yeah, it's not all of. Well, we were. I was with Alina and Selma and a bunch of other brilliant people. We had a good conversation, but I think a common denominator for this is, of course, we're still struggling to find out what is the causation, between all these different initiatives, all these different, both the recommendations, but also the media attention, etc., and the actual impact. And that is it's a question that I think will continue posing again and again for years to come, because it's so hard to make that argument. But we also had a few other very interesting things. Like, first of all, the French Assembly really does stand out. It had a proper budget, it had a proper strategy for its communication, but there was also Macron. And we were discussing, I don't think we concluded specifically, but we were discussing what the impact of that kind of a public figure is, both in good and bad, because it wasn't black and white. And then there was just a bit of talk about, and this was Alina's point, but I think it's a point well worth underlining, that there's something about the maturity of the public debate around this. It's different culturally, how well known these assemblies are, how much they've been in the conversation in general, and whether or not there's a system that kind of knows how to time it with a policy window, so that we're actually doing something that has a chance of having an impact, because it's a part of something that's actually taking place here now. So for France, there seems to be something that stands out, and it's not necessarily the same for a lot of other assemblies that have been more happening, kind of, well, for various reasons, but maybe a little bit outside of an actual impact window. But we had much more. So if anyone else from the group wants to add, go ahead.
So there's a French academic called Yves Saint-Omer, who I think you probably know, and he has this way, and actually no, and Nabila Abbas was on the call earlier. I think she might have gone, and they did this really interesting analysis of what they call different imaginaries of climate assemblies, and they said that the French Assembly is just qualitatively different from other assemblies because it was so political, whereas other assemblies were almost like apolitical. It was almost like happening outside of politics. And although that might in some ways be what some deliberative Democrats want, is this kind of very protected space, is that it meant that no one was paying attention to it because it didn't have that kind of political thing. So it's really real tension, isn't it? Because people, I'm not saying you, but people like you who work in organizations like Democracy X want to talk about the integrity of processes and kind of want to talk about ensuring that the citizens are protected from outside interests, etc. But at the same time, by opening some of those gates, then actually we can have impact. I think there's a real tension here for practitioners and for commissioners and for others. And certainly in some of the assemblies we've looked at, the commissioners are scared of public engagement and scared of, so I think we've got to recognize all of that.
I feel like quickly responding on that, Graham, because I think there's something interesting. We had the debate specifically about whether Macron was also a part of politicizing it, but it is a political instrument too, right? So that I feel that's kind of an important question to be discussing. We do want assemblies to be a part of a political debate. We do want them to impact the political debate. But of course, the process itself needs its integrity. And I don't think those two things rule each other out. But nailing how to make that happen in the right way is still not something I feel that we fully know how to do as a community.
Yeah. I think the other thing we have to mention and wasn't mentioned is, again, the context of protest and yellow vests and the state, that just, again, created this context for the assembly, which I don't think we've seen replicated elsewhere. A lot of other places, it's been very much managed by political elites. This is a kind of good governance process rather than a sort of response to social movement. Anyway, this shouldn't be a discussion between you and I, however wonderful it is to share space with you. Morten, was there someone from your group? Is it you, Morten, or is it someone else? Oh,
I think, yeah, I will do I will try my best at least to give a small overview.
Peter. So Peter's coming.
Yeah,
Peter Velger from Louvain.
Yeah.
How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah.
Good,
I just started here at the research institute here. So yeah, happy to share about the discussion. So I think for our group, we also talked a lot about the media, and Stephen shared that he saw how negative the media was, at least for a big part, and we were kind of grappling with the causation question. At some level, it seems that having more noise, like the media making more noise, seems to lead to some good things, at least maybe also in France, nationally, having more of these assemblies. For example, with the assembly at the end of the, what do you call it, the end of life, also being followed quite shortly after it. Also, like outside of France, also like many organizations picked up this idea of having like a bigger climate assemblies. But another interesting point that was raised is that sometimes it also seems, for example, the perception is that in this case, with the CCC, that actually not so much has been achieved. While there was so much media attention, while in some cases there's like much less media attention and much less has been achieved, but still somehow they make it appear that everything went so good. So yeah, so a question there in how can I don't know, maybe we can create more closure or like reflect these things a bit better, also maybe as a community to also maybe involve the media more in these processes. Also comments of Thorsten in general to document these processes better, which is sometimes also always not so carefully done. I think Claire then she reframed the question of impact quite nicely, because we were talking so much about how to translate these recommendations into policy, which is an important aspect. But especially here with the CCC, how can we actually know if these recommendations that came out of the assembly, if they lead to reductions in carbon emissions and things that we're really thinking about in this context. Also in that regard, the idea of cherry picking came up a bit in the presentations. So it would be interesting to see maybe if cherry picking can be then also be a force for good. For example, if for example some recommendations with the most impact in terms of carbon reduction are chosen, I would say probably that's unlikely to be the case. But And what else? Just trying to see in my notes here. Yeah, it's of course also interesting to see, of course, that the recommendations, when they get blocked by lobbyists, which in a sense is not such a bad thing. At least it means, you know, that things are moving. But Stephen then also said that it's important not only that that the field engages more with you know, the real politics, much more also, you know, going towards maybe the politicization, but then especially also, of course, you know, on working on making it work with the politicians, because of course that connection oftentimes is the most crucial, you know, despite having a lot of media attention or not. I think that's about it for me. If my group mates maybe want to compliment.
I think one of the interesting things, Peter, is this. I think there was a sort of, and it's, you know, a perverse naivety in this community of sort of, we will do a great process. The recommendations will just have this moral force that will make people implement them, and somehow forgetting that there was a, you know, there was politics out there. And it's really interesting with the impact assessments. I really like the fact that Claire and Selma highlighted the role, the study of the role of interests who are blocking the process, because we tend to, you know, on our impact analysis, try and look at did it have certain outcomes, and don't tell enough of a story about why those outcomes didn't happen. And if we actually, now that we know that particular interests will maneuver in those sorts of ways, we ought to develop impact strategies for that. You know, so I think it's really, this kind of work can open up really interesting possibilities for future assemblies. So thank you for that, Peter. That was great. And the last one was from our group, which was Coco. And it became a sort of Q&A for Coco, which was fine. I mean, it was really interesting. But we put her through her paces. But Coco, and you agreed beforehand that you would reflect on it, and then you were the subject of most of the discussion. So
I'll report back.
Report back on your trauma. No, there was no trauma. Report back on your.
I think mainly,
you know,
key issues. I mean, even just, we were just saying how, even as a presenter, you know, it's like there's a huge amount of material. It's very dense. It's quite difficult looking at the data to make sense of what does this all mean. What does it mean, and where can we go from here with that? It's quite unclear in that sense. You know, a couple of questions came up about sort of why the journalists were so involved in the process, because we know that differs from other assemblies. It's not always the case, and was that an active decision on the part of the organizers? Another thing was what were the objectives of the communication strategy, or indeed was there one? You know, Graham, you were saying like that it was sort of just like they were trying to just get as much out there as possible. Was there a strategy? You know, not so much. And how hard it is, I guess we can say how hard it is to design a communication strategy that is effective and that does get all the key points across. We were discussing as well, you know, how we can see what the discussion on social media about the coverage of the convention is. Philippe mentioned earlier on, just like as a citizen, the biggest thing that he remembers was everyone discussing about the reduction of the national speed limit, and we were saying how there were very specific recommendations that were indeed like really highly discussed in the media, that being one of them, like the ban on 5G being another one, and that kind of thing. So yeah, we were seeing like very specific critiques of the more controversial recommendations. And Graham, you were talking about the importance of support for assembly members, both during the assembly and afterwards. And I think, yeah, you're working on some kind of framework for. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. I'm muting myself because I keep coughing. Thank you for the plug. I will send you £5 afterwards. But we're just about to publish something, or not. We're in the process of working up Morton from the KNOCA group at Democracy X, and Pete Bryant are from Shared Future, are actually working on a guide on how to support members post-assembly, and part of that is to do with communication. Not all about communication, but obviously that. Coco, that was a great summary. The other thing that was raised from talking with Coco was about how, and because we had someone from Michaela who was at Southampton University in our group, was the data sets that both you've produced, and also the ones that potentially also Alina has produced. There's some really interesting opportunities here to do some more sophisticated analysis than we were able to. And maybe one of the things that we try and do when we publish this is also help people get access to the data that you've generated, because I think that would be really fantastic.
Yeah.
There's a quick comment which I just want to share with people from Tessa. Tessa, can you just jump into the call and just make that point, because I think it was a really important one. Is that, are you willing and able to speak? Or maybe she's not there, Tessa? Okay. So what Tessa was saying was, would it be useful to actually share?
Sorry, Graham.
Tessa's there now.
I keep on clicking. I don't know what's going on. Maybe there's a lot of going on with my computer.
You want
and
to
it's just slow.
swap Tessa and Coco out? That would be great. Because I just think it's a nice final remark, Tessa. If we can get
I mean, I guess maybe you could call it some kind of feedback loop on, you have the results and then of impact, and then you feed them back to the people who will be making some of these recommendations. So to what extent would some kind of supplementary information, what impact could that have to citizens if they knew some of these things? Like, for example, not to do so many recommendations, or to do recommendations that were only aligned to one kind of thing. It's something I've been thinking about recently, about future work programs. So
there are some assemblies that have started to include a feedback session from people working in public administration or other stakeholders, or have actually involved them in direct engagement. And I think that's really interesting, because they can talk about the experience from their perspective. But I think actually providing citizens with an insight into what has had impact in the past.
Yeah, it's before the fact or while it's actually happening.
No, I think that's right. I think that's really useful. Thanks, Tessa. That's a really useful, reflective comment on that. So, right, just some final things for us. I've got just a couple of points. First of all, we've got 3 draft reports. We did say don't cite. We can't stop you citing them. We just want you to make sure that when you do cite them, that at the moment that they are drafts, and we will in the next hopefully in the next month have final versions of them up and ready to be used, because I think they're really important. I think everyone who was involved in writing them and in producing them and supporting them recognizes that there are limitations with them, but they're a damn sight better than what we had before. So thank you to Alina, to Claire, Coco, Jose Luis and Selma for the work you've done, because it is without doubt contributing to our better understanding of what we've done, of the impact of these processes, and how we can think about impact strategies better. I want to flag the fact that Mission Publique is doing some work with us at the moment about communication strategies, and hopefully the work, in particular the work that Jose Luis and Coco and their colleagues have done, can help feed that. I mean, the relationship between actual strategies and then what happens is a really interesting question. And the final thing I just wanted to flag was we've got one more event before the end of the year, and that's on the 26th of November. It's a learning call, which will be on Sweden's Climate Assembly. And Sweden's Climate Assembly is interesting for 2 reasons. Well, lots of reasons actually, but the 2 I particularly like. One is it was organized independently by a group of researchers with an aim of affecting public discourse and not necessarily government policy. They wanted to affect government policy, but their aim was to raise a broader debate about climate issues. And so they focused a lot on their media strategy and involving influencers in their process. So that's, I think, really interesting thing. And the second is the people who ran it were systems modelers. And so they also tried to think about how they could introduce systems thinking into the process, and found it very difficult actually. But I think there's some really interesting learning from that. So 26th of November, that's already on the KNOCA website. Look forward to to that. Oh, Laurie has said, can I say anything about Norway? This stuff's going mad in the thing. There's a couple of assemblies happening in Norway. Actually, just an update. An assembly is about to start in the Netherlands. There's one just starting in Norway, which is being run by government, and there'll be one next year being run by civil society organizations, being commissioned by civil society organizations, which is looking at the future of their national wealth fund and broader questions about the contribution of Norway to the to global climate change. So some really interesting stuff happening. And what's really, I think, fascinating is the extent to which these assemblies that are happening now are picking up on the stuff that we've learned from the last 3 to 4 years, which if anything, that is actually what KNOCA is about. So thank you for everybody who's been involved in that collective knowledge development and curation process. As ever, it's been an absolute pleasure to spend a couple of hours with you. I hope you've enjoyed it. We gave you too much information. It was a really poor pedagogy, but we really wanted to give you a sense of what these reports are finding. Read them at your pleasure and at your leisure, and please do send us any thoughts you have, because they're still in the draft, in the finalizing stage. Once again, the report that this will be live in a couple of will not be live, sorry, it will be on our website within a day or two. Please do share widely, and once again, enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.